Hello, my name is Dewey Cornell. I'm a professor of education at the University of Virginia, and I study school safety. Thank you for inviting me to make this presentation. I'm sorry I'm not able to be with you in person, but at least you can be sure that I'll finish on time. And if this presentation turns out to be a little boring, you can just fast forward to the end and I'll never know. Anyway, I'm going to cover a lot of material, so pardon me for moving quickly through these slides. You can Google the Virginia Youth Violence Project and get more information, copies of our studies, or copies of these slides. I'm going to cover three topics today. I'm going to say a little bit about the concept of threat assessment and distinguish it from zero tolerance. I'm going to talk about our research in Virginia and then our newest research in Florida. So how often do schools conduct threat assessments anyway? Many states now require threat assessment teams, and an NCES survey found that over 60% of U.S. schools report that they have a threat assessment program. So it's kind of a tricky question that depends on what you mean by threat assessment. Take a look at this girl. When a student is angry or upset, every teacher, counselor, or administrator is going to do some kind of threat assessment. Just now, I bet you did a threat assessment of this girl. You checked out her body language. You made some assessment of how angry she seems. And if she was a student in your classroom, you would be thinking about what you know about her and whether she's going to argue with you or perhaps get in a fight. How would you make this determination? And would this determination vary depending on her race or ethnicity or how she was dressed? My point is that threat assessment is something we all do all the time. The question is, do we do it individually, subjectively, intuitively, or do we have a systematic process? If a threat is reported to school administration and they do not have a formal threat assessment process, schools typically rely on zero tolerance. They automatically remove the student from school. But removing a student from school does not increase safety. We want to supervise and support our students, not to send them out somewhere where we're unable to help them. So threat assessment is an alternative to zero tolerance. I'd go so far to say that threat assessment is an antidote to zero tolerance. Zero tolerance is a failed disciplinary practice that applies the same strict discipline to students regardless of the circumstances. In contrast, threat assessment teams are trained to consider the students' intentions, the circumstances, and the seriousness of their actions. Now, the formal term is behavioral threat assessment and management, which we often shorten to threat assessment. But it always involves three steps: identification, which occurs when somebody reports a concern that they think someone is threatening or planning or thinking about some type of violent act. The evaluation phase is when the team gathers information and makes a determination of the seriousness of the threat. And the third process is when the team initiates some type of assistance to address the underlying problem, conflict, or concern. Now, threat assessment was first used in government to protect public officials. It's widely used in business and industry to prevent workplace violence. But threat assessment in schools is different, has different features, and needs to be conducted differently. Schools are unique settings because they're filled with young people, and young people are more likely to make threatening statements. They're more likely, in many cases, to engage in physical fights. But we have to be careful not to overreact to student misbehavior because it would have such serious negative consequences if a student is expelled or arrested, for example. And finally, schools have an overarching duty to educate all of our students. So threat assessment must be concerned with helping and supporting students as well as preventing violence. There are really two kinds of errors in threat assessment: overreaction. We don't want to overreact to threats that are not serious. such as this example of a little boy who was expelled from school under zero tolerance for bringing a piece of plastic to school that happened to be shaped like a gun for his action figure. On the other hand, we want to avoid underreaction when a student brings a firearm to school with serious intent. Now, there are legitimate questions about the fairness and equity of school discipline in the United States. Students of color and students with disabilities are disciplined at disproportionate rates. And although these statistics refer to general discipline practices, there is concern that they might recur in the practice of threat assessment. Threat assessment must be a fair and equitable process. One indication of fairness is that we avoid excessive punishment or criminalization for minor misbehavior. An indication of equity is that treatment of students from different racial and ethnic backgrounds is the same, and that students are not discriminated against based on race, ethnicity, disability status. So we developed the comprehensive school threat assessment guidelines with these thoughts in mind. It was developed at the University of Virginia in 2001 with the assistance of a team of researchers, experts in the field, and a work group of educators and practitioners. Our effort was to train multidisciplinary teams to gather information, follow a decision tree to distinguish threats that are not serious, which we call transient, from threats that are serious, which we call substantive, and to take protective action as appropriate, but always to be focused on trying to resolve the problem underlying the student's threatening statement or behavior. We use a 5-step decision tree that allows teams to resolve most threats quickly and easily and focus their time on the more serious threats. Now, I can't possibly explain all the details of this model, so let me just give you a very brief overview. In many cases, the report of a threat turns out to be a false rumor or misunderstanding. That's not a threat, and it's resolved at step 1. We also have threats that are merely expressions of humor, or maybe expressions of frustration that does not reflect a serious intent to harm someone. I could kill you for that, for example, is a common rhetorical statement that is not a serious threat. We resolve these cases at step 2. Step 3 is used when a threat seems to be a threat to fight someone that seems serious, and it's usually resolved with some form of conflict resolution. A threat that's more than a threat to fight, that involves a threat to shoot, stab, or kill someone, requires a more comprehensive assessment. This will involve mental health professionals on our school team, and it will involve law enforcement in the event that there is a criminal act that has occurred or that there's a need for law enforcement protective action. Well, how often do these different types of threats occur? We recently collected data from the state of Florida, where they have statewide implementation of the CSTAG model. And we found in a sample of over 22,000 cases that 11% of threats were resolved as not a threat. 71% were transient threats that were not considered serious and were easily resolved. And then a smaller percentage were either serious substantive threats involving a fight or very serious substantive threats involving a threat to kill, shoot, stab, commit some really serious act of violence. We've done a lot of research on this model for more than 20 years. We started with several field tests. We've conducted a series of controlled studies, and we've recently completed a large-scale implementation assessment in the state of Florida. Here's a list of our top 20 studies. Why don't I just go through each of them one at a time and give you all the statistical results? Well, you know I've got a time limit, so I'm not going to do that, but we'd be happy to send you copies. And let me give you a summary. In brief, in thousands of threat cases that we have studied, they were resolved without violence. Very few threats were attempted. Most of them were fights. in 99% of the cases, there were no serious injuries, meaning an injury that involved hospital treatment. There was no shootings or fatalities to date. Schools reported less bullying and less peer aggression. And on school climate surveys, students and teachers have reported a more positive school climate in schools using the CSTAG model compared to either schools not using threat assessment or schools using some alternative model of threat assessment. We know that most students remain in school. There are reductions in the use of out-of-school suspension and little or no racial disparity in suspension. Let me just briefly mention our most rigorous study, a randomized controlled trial of 40 schools over 1 year. We had 201 students identified as threatening violence. And what we found is that in students who received a threat assessment, they were far more likely to receive counseling services and have parental involvement, and they were far less likely to have a long-term suspension or be placed in an alternative school. We also found no differences between Black and white students in these outcomes. Let me jump ahead to our most recent study in Florida. After the 2018 Parkland shooting, Florida mandated threat assessment in its 4,000 public schools. All of the schools received CSTAG training and submitted case data to the Florida Department of Education. For last year, we received data from 60 of 67 Florida districts, about 23,000 threat cases. As you can see, threat assessments were conducted at all grade levels, K through 12. The blue bars show transient threats. Most threats are transient, easily resolved. A smaller percentage were substantive threats. Most of those involved threats to fight. A very small percentage, again, about 5%, were very serious substantive threats. In terms of disciplinary and legal outcomes, here is a breakdown for white, Black, and Hispanic students who received a threat assessment. As you can see, fewer than a third of them, about a quarter of them, were suspended out of school. There were very small differences in race and ethnicity for out-of-school suspension. Far smaller differences than what we see generally in school discipline. As you know, typically Black students are suspended out of school at 2 to 3 times the rate as white students. Here, for this group of students, the differences were, a couple of percentage points. There were also some differences in change in placement, but very small. Very low rates of school expulsion. And as you can see, in terms of law enforcement responses to a student's threat, fewer than 1% were arrested. Fewer than 3% had court charges, and fewer than 1% were incarcerated. Now, a Colorado study by University of Colorado researchers also found very few disparities in disciplinary and law enforcement outcomes for schools in Colorado. If we look at students with a disability with an IEP, individual education program, we again found very small, not statistically significant in this case, differences in whether students were suspended, had a change in placement, were expelled, or had some kind of law enforcement outcome. In conclusion, there were small or negligible differences in disciplinary and legal outcomes, although, of course, we want to understand those differences and see if we can reduce them so that they don't exist. Teams must always monitor their student outcomes for fairness and equity. Districts must investigate and take prompt action if there's any evidence of unfairness or inequity. We need further research to examine the generalizability of these findings, which we're doing now across 5 states. We also need to understand the mechanisms that produce these good effects. What are the factors in the threat assessment process that contribute to fairness and equity in outcomes? I've listed some possible factors here. You might have some ideas of other factors that we want to examine. In conclusion, threat assessment is a promising approach to school safety. It can help schools avoid a zero tolerance approach and respond in a fair and equitable manner. Thank you very much.